Bom dia a todos e todas que nos assistem. Hoje abrimos mais um encontro do Seminário Internacional de Governança da Internet, uma atividade da Escola de Governança da Internet. E hoje o tema de debate é o multissetorialismo e processos deliberativos, como promover inclusão e aprimorar representatividade e a democracia nestes processos. Este debate fecha o primeiro eixo do Seminário sobre Governança da Internet e na próxima semana iniciamos os debates do eixo 2. Nós damos as boas-vindas aos palestrantes e ao moderador, agradecemos por aceitar o nosso convite, e eu vou apresentar aqui o Virgílio, que vai abrir o debate e moderar essa mesa com convidados tão especiais. O Virgílio Almeida é pesquisador e professor associado ao Berkman Klein Center, da Universidade de Harvard, e professor emérito da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. Ocupou os cargos de professor visitante na Boston University, Harvard e New York University. Ele tem PhD em Ciência da Computação pela Vanderbilt University e é membro titular da Academia Brasileira de Ciências e da World Academy of Science. Autor de vários livros, dentre eles Performance by Design, Computer Capacity Planning by Example e Governance for the Digital World, Neither More State Nor More Market. Foi secretário nacional de Políticas de Informática no período de 2001 a 2015 e coordenador do Comitê Gestor da Internet e comissário da Global Commission for Stability of Cyberspace. Virgílio, muito obrigada por ter aceitado o nosso convite, é um prazer recebê-lo aqui hoje, uma honra para nós ter você como moderador dessa mesa.
Thank you, Luisa, for the introduction, for the very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to share this panel with two distinguished professors, Professor Jeannette Hoffman and Professor Jean-Marie Chenou. So I'm going to just read the short bio of both so you can understand how distinguished they are. Professor Jeannette Hoffman is a professor of internet politics at the Freie University in Berlin and heads the WZB research groups Politics of Digitalization, which studies how today's societies make sense of and shape the digital transformation. She's also one of the founding directors of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin, and the principal investigator at the Weizenbaum Institute of Network Society. Welcome, Jeannette. It's a pleasure having you here in this panel. The other participant is Professor Jean-Marie Chenou. He is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Prior, he was assistant professor at the University of Lausanne and visiting researcher at the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and a master in international relations from University of Panthéon-Assas in Paris too. His research focuses on internet governance and digital transformation from the perspective of political economy and science, technology, and society. It's interesting. Welcome, Professor Jean-Marie. It's interesting to observe that we have two distinguished participants that are from different areas of science. And that shows the importance of a multidisciplinary view on the problems related to the digital world. So again, welcome both of you and welcome everyone that is attending this panel. I will present a few slides just to set the context for the discussions and for the points to be made by our two participants. So it's going to be just 10 minutes and I will discuss the main issues here. Let me see if you guys see my screen. Okay, So the title of this session is Multistakeholderism and the Deliberative Process, Inclusion, Representativeness, and Democracy. And as I said, we have two distinguished professors, Jeannette and Jean-Marie. And so just to give this context, it is interesting to look back 25 years ago. And I picked up a part of a document that was very important at that time, that the document called a Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace in 1996. And John Perry Barlow, he said, the perspective was that the digital world would embody a space of full freedom of connecting people's ideas and information. That was the utopic vision at that time. But what we have now is completely different from that utopic vision. I will not say that it's a dystopia, but it has some aspects that are very concerning, especially for the democratic societies. So at that time, what we expected was to have what was called at that time cyber democracy. Years later, we had the Arab Spring. So there was a lot of hope in the freedom and in supporting democratic government and regimes. So that was a vision in the beginning of the years 2000. But things, as I said, evolved differently. What we have now is a set of very powerful platforms that offer us a lot of opportunities, convenience, but also brings some problems that are consequences of the way these platforms are organized. Three aspects of this, the presence of this platform that all of us use and enjoy the benefits, but also has this, the drawbacks that I will talk about. So we have platforms that are operated by algorithms, decision-making that are based on algorithmic decisions, and we have a lot of data collection. So we have these global platforms, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp groups, Amazon, Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, Apple, the personal digital assistants. But in a different color, I just want to emphasize that governments all over the world are moving to create government platforms that will somehow look like this platform that we know. And so what are the consequences of this global space, of this digital global space? So to what we see now as the actual digital world. We saw in the first week of January the storming of Capitol Hill that was organized on social media, in particular on Facebook in the United States. And it seemed that people at this movement was convinced that election was stolen, and that was created by the content that was circulating among the different far-right groups in the US and also in the world. Actually, another aspect of this digital world, it is that the digital world is not only the internet, it's beyond the internet. In this case, it's about algorithms that decide about parole, about judicial decisions made by courts in the US. And that the title of this picture is an algorithm that grants freedom or takes it away. We also saw recently in UK, the the movement against the algorithms that was used to estimate the grade of the students to get into universities after they finished the high school, and they didn't accept the algorithms grade, and also they said that there was a lot of injustice and bias in the results. And finally, what we see today, it's a lot of headlines showing the problems of the digital world. Not only the internet, not only the platform, but the general problems that are popping up in the day-to-day life in the digital world, in politics, in healthcare, in economics, in several aspects of the daily life. So the big question that our participants of this panel will discuss today, one of the big questions is how to govern digital technologies based on pillars such as respect for human rights, international law, and availability of meaningful opportunity for all people and nations. So we need to create mechanisms to provide some of these benefits to the global society. So the idea that we will discuss here is internet governance, but I would like to present a concept of digital governance that, as I said, goes beyond internet governance. Digital governance is the capacity of polycentric institutions in the digital world to govern in a legitimate, inclusive, and secure manner the use of digital commons to produce sustainable services and public policy implemented by governments, firms, in a non-territorial and results-based manner. So that's a theoretical definition of digital governance. And if we try to summarize this in a picture, we see that digital governance includes several mechanisms of governance related to internet, to digital platform governance, to AI, artificial intelligence governance, cybersecurity, and data governance. So that's the holistic view of governance for the digital world that involves joint decisions, transparency, and accountability for all those blocks that make up the digital world. So digital governance, again, a theoretical view of that, meta-governance structures are based on three elements: decision-making, transparency and accountability, and coordination, because we have multiple institutions involved in that. So the final slide that is related to the main topic of this session is: what is the role of multi-stakeholder models in this global digital governance? What are the main problems of the digital governance, of the digital world that demand governance structures? What governance and meta-theoretical elements can be applied to governing the digital world? And what are the challenges to create a governance process to the digital world? So these are some initial ideas just to make the context for the presentations of the participants of our panel. So I would like to turn on to Professor Jeanette for her comments, observation, and ideas.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also for this really good overview, Virgilio. I think the point you made at the end, that this is the decade of governance and regulation, also has to do with the fact that digital services penetrate all parts of society. And therefore, national regulations kick in and they provoke so much resistance that the question of how to govern the digital becomes a really important issue. I've been asked to talk about the multi-stakeholder approach, which I like to do because I was not only part of it for a long time, I also wrote about it in a rather critical manner. And what I will now do is sort of summarize my findings while participating and as well doing research about the multi-stakeholder approach. What the term multi-stakeholder doesn't really make clear is that processes that try to integrate, to involve various actors of society is not a new idea. Under different terms, this has a long tradition in many parts of the world. The sort of more general term would perhaps be tripartite organizations. And traditionally, it was governments, meaning the state, the private sector, and workers' organizations. These were seen as the sort of most important, relevant representatives of society that needed to be involved in order for the government to be able to sort of regulate capital and labor in a way where there would not be too much protest. Perhaps the most famous example of such tripartite organizations is the International Labour Organization, a United Nations agency that was founded already in 1919. And it also comprised representatives of governments, employers, and workers. There are, of course, many examples on the national level. I've asked my Brazilian colleague, Clara Keller, and she told me about an organization called CONAR, which regulates advertising activities in Brazil. The more recent example that you are probably all aware of is the Marco Civil, which was negotiated in a very open manner with the participation of lots of civil society groups. More generally, we see in many countries that media sort of follow a process of regulated self-regulation, meaning in the shadow of the state. Those responsible for running, say, broadcasting systems involve societal groups as a form of soft oversight of media. We find that in many countries. So why do I mention these examples? I mention them to say that multi-stakeholderism is neither new nor is it rare. It sort of builds on an established process with a long history. But it has to do with what I call internet exceptionalism, that we are often not aware of it. Because the internet was new, everything the internet created and everything that the internet attracted seemed to be new either. This internet exceptionalism is quite unfortunate because it prevents us from learning from other social sectors. And perhaps there is a lot to learn from sort of innovative efforts that preceded the internet. And for this reason, focusing on multi-stakeholder approaches, I did scan the literature and look at other examples of multi-stakeholderism to see what other processes there are, what they exactly do. And the sort of basic question that I asked while looking at the literature is, does it actually work? And if multi-stakeholderism doesn't work, what are the problems? And what I found, and this is perhaps doesn't come as a surprise to other people who have been involved in multi-stakeholder initiatives, it often doesn't work well. Multi-stakeholder approaches are often quite disappointing when we look at the outcomes, despite the fact that people devoted so much time and tried so hard to change things. So why is that? Perhaps we start first with the goals. I could identify 3 goals that translate into what I call 3 great promises of multi-stakeholderism. The first one is the ideal of global representation. The second one is the sort of promise or ideal of democratizing policymaking. And the third one, perhaps the most important one, is to improve policy outcomes, to make things better than they have been. And when we look at it in more detail, we see on the one hand procedural goals. And by that, I mean this idea of democratizing policymaking, particularly in the transnational sphere. This is particularly important for the internet, which was, as Virgilio pointed out, a transnational network infrastructure. So our traditional national-based forms of democratic decision-making didn't really apply. So there was a strong motive to democratize decision-making in a transnational matter. And of course, the second point is substantial, meaning multi-stakeholder processes try to sort of improve the outcome of decision-making that by sort of having civil society being more involved and having their voice heard. So why does it not work out? Or what is it exactly that doesn't work out? I think one can see several dilemmas in multi-stakeholder initiatives, and 2 of them I want to describe in a bit more detail. Dilemma 1 has to do with representing the people, meaning democratizing decision-making by having other actors involved as those that usually dominate the international spheres. So in a very basic sense, one can say that it is impossible to be representative in a way that nobody is excluded. If we want to be represented in a way that everybody is included, then we couldn't make any decisions, because if everybody has a voice, we will never come to any agreement. So this idea of being more representative is always contested because it is unclear who exactly needs to be heard and who can be excluded, or to put it in a different way, who could represent whom. We have procedures for that on the national level, but we don't have procedures outside of general elections. So it's always contested, the idea of being representative, and the bodies who try to who sort of build on the multi-stakeholder approach are always struggling in face of the criticism of excluding people. And therefore, they always try to become more representative and to be more legitimate in their decision-making process. The best example I know of is ICANN. ICANN has become, over its serious attempt to be more representative and more legitimate, enormously bureaucratic in its decision-making procedures. In fact, ICANN is such a bureaucratic organization by now that I often don't understand what they're talking about, despite the fact that I used to be involved there. It's a very elaborate process, and this attempt to be more legitimate by representing many people as an indirect side effect, an unwanted side effect, excludes many people because it takes so much time, so much effort to understand how it works and also to be involved. for example, these calls they have around the clock, and everybody needs to sort of at some point get up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to be fair and representative, etc. So it becomes clear after a while that not many people are able to sustain these processes. And what we see is that particularly NGOs from the global south, they struggle to stay involved in these international processes over a longer period of time because it's so labor intensive and it costs a lot. And when NGOs have to set priorities, being sort of something that they can do locally and something they can do internationally, say something where they see effects immediately versus being involved in organizations where it's long-term involvement before you see any practical effects, it's usually ICANN that they drop first. So, and then these processes are becoming less, paradoxically less representative than they wanted to be by trying to be representative. So this is the first dilemma that many international multi-stakeholder processes face. And the second dilemma is that multi-stakeholder processes suffer from the very same power imbalances that they try to fight. There was years ago an anecdote about who attends international internet governance processes. And the anecdote was, try to imagine an airplane, who sits in first class and who sits very much in the back near the toilets. And it was civil society and a few government people who would you find near the toilets. And the business people would sit in first and second class. And that is, I think, quite a nice image for the imbalance of resources that you find in international multi-stakeholder processes. Who stays in the good hotels, who can sort of participate in all the meetings and who can't. ICANN, to be fair, try to take care of this by funding those who were the resource poor in ICANN, and that is the at-large membership. They set up a fund for these people to be able to attend the meetings. And again, you see unwanted side effects of this funding the at-large membership. What you see with certain people, I won't sort of mention any names, you see people who are so keen on attending these meetings and travel around the world that being at ICANN meetings becomes more important than the outcomes of being involved in the process. So certain pathological effects are created through funding a certain class of people. Both of this is not specific to internet governance. You also find it in other sectors, and these are just two of many dilemmas that you find in these processes. Now, does this mean we should no longer believe in the multi-stakeholder process? No, this is not my message, not at all. What I want to say is that we need to become less romantic and more realistic about what we can achieve with regard to these three ideals or promises. We won't rescue the world through multi-stakeholder processes. They are not per se much better than any other forms of regulation that we know. They struggle, in fact, with many of the shortcomings that traditional regulation also struggles with. So what I'm saying is we need to be realistic and work on them and need to be prepared that many of the ideas in terms of improvement we have might create side effects that we hate. So multi-stakeholder processes are, if you want, a building site where we need to experiment with new approaches and need to keep in mind that we might lose people via implementing new approaches because it's too expensive and too costly for them. So there are certain dilemmas that it's very difficult to get out of, but it still remains a laudable goal to sort of include as many people as possible, and also to try to improve policy processes by making issues more well known, by giving more people a voice, and also show how contested certain policy courses are. We cannot expect too much in terms of outcomes when it comes to the legitimacy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your comments and for the three dilemmas. I fully agree with them. And so we are going to move to Jean-Claude for his 15 minutes presentation. Then we will have the second part and the third part of our panel. So thank you again, Jeanette. It was great. Jean-Claude, please.
Jean-Marie. Yeah, thanks a lot, Virgilio.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thanks a lot, Virgilio. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And I'm glad and honored to be part of this discussion. I think it's very important, and I think it's important to come back to this discussion about multi-stakeholderism, multi-stakeholder governance, internet governance, after maybe some years where this discussion was a bit sidelined by other issues. And I really like the introduction by Virgilio saying we're talking about digital governance, which is a multi-sectorial, multi-stakeholder with different dimensions. And I think it's important to think about these different dimensions. I have some slides. And I just wanted to, as kind of an introduction, to highlight a few points on multi-stakeholderism as inclusion, representativeness, and democracy. And after, I think we can discuss the different points. I wanted to first highlight that there is no one definition of multi-stakeholderism, and it's a historical result of different influences. So when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, we do not necessarily talk about the same thing. So that's a first point that I wanted to make. The second point is that we abandon collectively the efforts to improve multi-stakeholderism when it was first implemented in internet governance after the World Summit on the Information Society in 2005. There were efforts and ideas and initiatives to improve multi-stakeholderism so that we can maybe not solve the dilemmas that were presented by Jeanette, but at least improve things in terms of these dilemmas. But they're basically abandoned now. And they're abandoned in a time where we need deliberation, where we need the representation of different stakeholders to govern the digital world. And I wanted to highlight as maybe some talking points for the discussion, possible ways forward with this multi-stakeholder model. So when I say there are different definitions of multi-stakeholderism in internet governance, Jeanette highlighted that it's also something that existed outside of internet governance, which is an important point, but I just wanted to focus on what does multi-stakeholderism mean when we talk about internet governance. And there were two models there. The 1990s model, and ICANN was at first a result of this 1990s model, that was a private sector-led, market-based approach to internet governance. Basically, and Virgilio quoted John Perry Barlow, it was a libertarian or maybe a neoliberal approach. It was hands-off approach. Governments should not be involved in internet governance. It should be led by the market, led by the private sector, and maybe at some point the government can set the condition, the enabling conditions for the market to operate in the digital world. This model was highly criticized, and the result of the criticism is kind of a hybrid model which is the multi-stakeholderism we have now in Internet governance, which is a model based on trying to preserve some parts of the status quo and give some more participation to new actors. So the World Summit on the Information Society, which took place between 2003 and 2005, came up with this definition, a working definition, and I want to highlight the idea of a working definition of Internet governance. It was by no way a definitive definition of Internet governance, and the multi-stakeholder idea there is expressed in this phrase, the implementation by governments, by the private sector, and by civil society in their respective roles of norms, etc., programs of Internet governance. So we have this idea of multi-stakeholderism being some kind of a balance between different roles by governments, by private sector, and by civil society. But there were no definitions of what these roles were. And we evolved towards a model, and Jeannette, I like this description by Jeannette of a plane with different classes. And we evolved towards a multi-stakeholder model that was basically based on the idea of elitism. We have different elites, the technical community, the business community, and some governments, especially the US and the European Union, wanted to preserve this kind of multi-stakeholder model based on neoliberal ideas of the 1990s. And I think this model is outdated now, and we have to think about what should multi-stakeholderism look like for the 21st century. That was basically, that was not an idea that was marginal back in the World Summit on the Information Society. There were ideas, there were initiatives, there were programs to improve Internet governance, especially I'm talking about countries and civil society organizations from the Global South, because this first definition of Internet governance excluded mainly actors from the Global South. So there was efforts. For example, Brazil and Brazilian organizations were part of this effort, but also South Africa, also India, and some authoritarian governments as well. So that was kind of a mixed message. They wanted to improve Internet governance, and there was this idea of an enhanced cooperation, like how to improve cooperation in Internet governance. But this was largely ignored. And we are in this situation where the Internet Governance Forum is renewed as the main multi-stakeholder forum for Internet governance. The ICANN has been transforming, evolving since its creation, but it's still the organization based on this original sin of a multi-stakeholder defined as elites working together to regulate the Internet. And we end up with a kind of a false dichotomy. Either we want to stay with the status quo, we want to preserve the status quo, Internet governance as we know it, or we go towards intergovernmentalism, which means an intergovernmental organization to govern the Internet with a strong representation of authoritarian governments. So this false dichotomy kind of prevents us to think about a renewed multi-stakeholderism, an improved multi-stakeholderism, and the voices of the reformists, of the people that wanted to reform Internet governance within a multi-stakeholder model were largely ignored. So I share the view expressed by Jeannette of the critique of multi-stakeholderism. My work on multi-stakeholderism has been very critical of the elitism, of the over-representation of powerful actors, and the kind of second-class citizen of the civil society organization and especially users from the global south. So it had to evolve, but it evolved in a way that is not completely satisfactory. So that was I wanted to do some kind of advertisement for a new book that was released in the last few days. I just received my hard copy, edited by Blaine Haggard, Natasha Tusikov, and Jana Scholte. And this is a collective effort to think about power and authority in internet governance with the evolution that we saw, and Virgilio made a great introduction to this evolution that are not dystopian, as Virgilio said, but they are concerning. So basically the message of this book is that there is a false dichotomy between the status quo and the authoritarian model. The idea of a digital Cold War or the US model versus the Chinese model, they're kind of drawing a false dichotomy, drawing like two different solutions to internet governance. But the idea of the book is that we have to look beyond this false dichotomy and find new ways to organize internet governance and internet regulation. And I have a chapter in the book, and one of the things that I say in the chapter, and I think Virgilio expressed it quite nicely in the introduction, internet governance is and has always been about the regulation of digital capitalism. Virgilio talked about digital world. I wanted to be a little bit more precise, and I talk about digital capitalism because of the importance of capitalism in how internet has evolved over the last few years. So the idea is that internet governance, when we talk about internet governance, we are also talking about these issues that were highlighted by Virgilio in terms of platform capitalism, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of big data, and all these kind of digital transformations that we're living. And these are not two separate debates. And internet governance should be, and I really like the idea of digital governance defined by Virgilio, should be about how to regulate digital capitalism. What is the role of the state in regulating the digital capitalism? What is the role of the private sector? And what is the role of other organizations from the civil society? And the answer, like the original answer to this question was hands-off approach. Governments should not be involved. And there is kind of a historical link between these decisions in the 1990s in internet governance and what we have now in terms of difficulties to regulate digital capitalism. Transnational corporation platforms that are mostly coming from the US and increasingly from China that are operating on a worldwide basis and that escape regulation. And Jeanette also said that there is a need for regulation, so states come and national government come and try and regulate, but this is not satisfactory either because these phenomena, first of all, they are transnational, they are global, so they cannot be solved at the national level, and also because it might end up in different internets as it is already a little bit happening, different regulation, different islands of internet, and this is not the idea of a global network. So possible ways forward, and building upon this idea by Jeanette that we should not throw the baby with the bathwater, and the multi-stakeholder governance has a lot of problems. It has evolved in a way that is not satisfactory, but the alternative, which is kind of emerging of authoritarian practices in internet governance, in digital governance, is concerning as well. So we have to critically assess multi-stakeholderism beyond naive views of deliberation and consensus. That was basically what Jeanette just said. There are things that are interesting in multi-stakeholder governance model, but many things that really do not work. So we have to critically assess and try to think about how to be inclusive, representative, democratic, but to think about the real world. The role of different stakeholders, I'm come back to this definition of government, civil society, and private sector in their respective roles, we have to discuss about the role of different stakeholders in light of the inevitable return of the state. This idea of sitting on the same table, governments, private sector, and civil society was very important in the 1990s and early 2000s in the US and in the European Union, maybe, but it doesn't apply to the rest of the world. It doesn't apply to current digital world. It doesn't apply to China. It doesn't apply to the global South. So we have to admit that the state is here to stay, and we have to see how we can maybe preserve some of the elements of multi-stakeholder governance while giving the overarching role to the state, to the government that is needed and that is an obvious situation in many parts of the world. And I think I have 2 points. We must acknowledge the relationship between internet governance and the regulation of digital capitalism. And like Virgilio said, it's digital governance, not only internet governance. We're not talking about technical issues, or not only about technical issues. We're also talking about how we can benefit from the digital transformation. And finally, we must preserve the deliberative nature of multi-stakeholderism. There are some elements of multi-stakeholder governance that should be preserved, and we have to think about new ways to think about multi-stakeholderism and to implement multi-stakeholderism. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's really nice.
Virgílio, precisa abrir o microfone.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Marie. It's really nice to participate in a panel with two panelists that, in addition to being very expert, they finish in the exact time. So that's something that's great to be. And thank you, both of you. And I think that you made very relevant points about the weaknesses and the strengths of multi-stakeholder models. One thing that I have two comments, and then I would like to ask you some to comment on my points. What in the past we saw that societies in different countries believed that multi-stakeholder model would be the solution for governance problems of the internet. But what we see in the recent years is that the main concerns of society, such as misinformation, spread of hate speech, cyber attacks, all of them are not being solved by multi-stakeholder models. Mm-hmm. They are being solved by traditional methods and means of governance, such as law, national laws. There is the NTZ-DG law in Germany. There is the law in Singapore. There is a Avia law in France. There are many national laws that tries to solve problems that societies are anxious to see solution. And then they ask for government. They ask for politicians to do something. And most stakeholders are not heard. They don't have something to play in this context. The other short comments that internet governance, in the case of ICANN, was concerned about numbers, names, but now most of the problems are related to content. So how can it? And content is very, it's a cultural thing, it's a very subjective thing. It depends on the country, it depends on the local culture. So it's hard to solve. Many people in political science, I know that Jean-Marie and Jeanette are from political science, they call it governance the wicked problem. So that's really hard to solve. And so these are the points that I would like to hear your comments and considerations. But before I leave, I would like to show a picture of something that Jeanette reminds that shows the difference of a multi-stakeholder system that works, and the multi-stakeholder system, as you said, that preserve the different classes. Let me just put this picture here because it's so nice. This picture was taken in the Net Mundial meeting that was organized by CGI and by many international organizations at that time. And we see that we had three different mics, one for each stakeholder: government, civil society, and private company. And there
was also picture, one for external participants. Don't forget that there were more mics.
That's right. You were right. We were at the advance in terms of organization, because we had the external participants from different parts of the world participating and have the same time slot and the mechanism to speak as we see in this picture, ambassadors waiting for civil society. It's a nice picture of the past, but maybe we can think of different mechanisms and structures for the future. Thank you. So Jeanette, please. It's your turn, 10 minutes for your comments and observations.
First, thank you very much for this picture. You have no idea how important this meeting has been also for me personally to sort of experience that change can happen, and that even with governments, there is a way forward to new processes of decision making. It was really, really important and also instructive to be part of this process. It was one of the highlights of my political career, I would say. So that was really important. But now to the point I actually wanted to make. When listening to Jean-Marie, I thought he warned of false dichotomies. And I think that's always a good point, because mentally we tend to think in either ors. And I think there is another dichotomy that has become false in the process of digitalization. And that is the dichotomy between private sector on the one hand and governments on the other. What we see instead, since we are sort of regulating data flows, governments and private sectors are both super keen on having access to data and thereby information about the citizens. And my experience is that governments don't mind private sector collecting data as long as they can make sure that they have access to these data, as long as they can legally sort of give themselves either via the police, via court orders, whatever, to have access to these data. Always on behalf of national security, of course. So the old dichotomy that we turn to the government when we dislike what the market does, or in the early days of the internet, where we turn to the market to get freed from this prison of telecommunication policy, this doesn't work anymore. And for me, this is a new justification of the multi-stakeholder process. We need to think of regulation not as either private sector or government, but as something where all need to be heard. And what has become, I think, much more important today than in the early days of internet governance is the role of human rights. Fundamental rights form the legal framework since we deal with content moderation. Different from classical media policy that still sort of informs the framework of regulation in Germany. We are not dealing with broadcasting media, and we don't deal with journalists, but with individuals speaking. Lots of hate speech come from people who are protected by human rights. This is the new dilemma, the new tension we are dealing with. How can we actually ensure our right to speak without in face of hate speech and disinformation, without curtailing human rights? That is nearly a paradox that we see at the moment. And that is a big challenge that I think we cannot solve by looking at digital capitalism. because it's too sort of rough a category to capture the fact that so much of what we sort of violation of law at the moment comes from individuals.
Thank you, Jeanette. Jean-Marie, for your
thanks a lot for sharing this very, very interesting picture of Net Mundial. I think when I was talking about the efforts to improve multi-stakeholderism, maybe Net Mundial was kind of the highlight of this. Like we can improve, we can go beyond what multi-stakeholder is, we can go beyond the IGF and try to make significant change and address significant issues such as the massive surveillance by the NSA and the kind of context that was Net Mundial's context. But I also wanted to share an anecdote about Net Mundial. That was the only time I was able to witness a multi-stakeholder drafting process. And it was interesting. There was this moment where the representative of Disney company stood up from the table and called the representative of France, saying, "Hey, we have to talk." And they talked on the side of the table and went back to the table. So I think it's kind of illustrates what Jeanette was saying about the false dichotomy between governments and the private sector. Sometimes they agree on maybe the importance of intellectual property rights in data collection and many things that are something that we should maybe address as a civil society or academia or different sectors. So and that's why I use digital capitalism in that particular chapter that I highlighted, and sometimes in my work, because we have to think about the economy and the politics of the digital transformation. We have to we have to study and analyze states and private companies and the combination between the two. So that's basically the idea of the word, of the expression digital capitalism. And just to go back to what Virgil said about the hate speech and the misinformation and the importance that it has. Since I moved to Colombia, I've seen the importance of addressing hate speech beyond maybe just what happens in the US and the Capitol storming. There was some issues in terms of peaceful politics, but in post-conflict societies, hate speech online means people assassinated on a daily basis. So we have to think about this issue of regulating hate speech, regulating content beyond maybe the idea that exists mainly in the US, that free speech must prevail at any time and private regulation is enough. It's not enough. It's not enough, and it has consequences in terms of peace and conflict, which are the most basic rights, human rights, is to live in a peaceful environment. So this is something that we have to address. And I agree, the idea to have national law addressing these issues and not taking into account the interests of maybe other stakeholders is concerning. It's not good enough. We have to think globally as well. Of course, there are different cultures, there are different political contexts, and rules have to be adapted to the local context. We cannot have one rule for the whole world. But as we can see in human rights, in other sectors, we can agree on a basic consensus, on a baseline, and then adapt this baseline according to the context, according to the culture that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Well, I think that you both, again, touched very critical questions. And I'm going to make a very quick comment, and then I will ask some questions that are arriving from the people that are attending this panel. One thing that the years that I was involved in this process of governance, I have observed that the civil society has more contributions to governance than governments and private sector. That was the practical thing that I have observed in the years that I was involved in that. And I think that the point made by Jeanette, human rights is the most important thing now, because it provides a clear context what should be moderated, what should be governed in terms of content, in terms of behavior. So it's a framework that is universally accepted. Although I think that governments do not like it in some situations, and the same with companies, but civil society has a very important role. So I have two questions. I think that for the future, it's not feasible to think of global governance organizations. For me, it's more realistic thinking of a polycentric framework with different governance organizations, not so big as ICANN, for instance, or other global organizations. And that is, the challenge is how to synchronize and how to make decisions based on the decision of these smaller organizations. That's one point. And as a consequence of that, my question also is how technology could be used to help to organize a framework with many different and small governance organizations. So these are two questions just for you both to, while I wait for the questions from the audience.
Virgilio, could you repeat the second question?
The second question, how can we use technology to allow this framework with many different organizations? In the beginning of internet governance, we had a lot of technology people. Then we moved from that to involve social science, researchers, people from political science. But now I think that we should consider how computer science or computing research can be used to make this governance something that works, and maybe using the multi-stakeholder models.
Mm-hmm. Shall I start with the first question?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
First of all, I wanted to add something. I can observe in Europe as a symptom of the fact that government and private sectors are not dichotomies any longer. They are not opposing, but often working together, that civil society more and more uses the strategy to go to court. And that has both to do with the fact that human rights have become so important in the regulation of the digital, but also that governments don't respect the freedom of the citizens, but are so keen on getting the same kind of information that the private sector has. So the court is the most important strategy. And we see in Europe lots of new NGOs emerging whose primary purpose is to collect funding for going to court. They pick specific, they become very sort of strategic in picking cases to go to court, to the sort of constitutional court, to prevent the government of undermining human rights. Schrems is the guy who did this in Austria with regard to Facebook and others, and also to sort of undermine the framework for data exchange between Europe and the US, and he has been successful twice. So our biggest friend in Europe at the moment is the European Court of Human Rights. So who would have thought that 10, 15 years ago? Nobody. And it is, I'm not sort of telling a heroic story here. The problem is that courts in itself are not democratically legitimized. These are, if you want, experts in the law, and we need their help to sort of prevent our rights. But it's not the parliament where these debates take place. These are becoming legal discourses that exclude, if you want, the majority of people because they lack the expertise to understand. And of course, again, it needs on finding capital to actually go to court, to hire lawyers and do these things. While this has been a long tradition in the US, it's rather new in Europe. So that I wanted to add. Now, in terms of global governance, yes and no, Virgilio. No, look at companies like Facebook. They still think they can run a global content policy. And they really try hard to keep this up. Also, their latest invention, the oversight board that they installed, tries to be representative, has experts from all regions of the globe. The idea is to create a content framework that covers the whole world. Will this work out? I have doubts whether this will work. But that's just one example. Another example is the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU. If you want to trade with the EU now, you need to accept at least a shallow version of this regulation. So in a way, we are sort of regulating the world more or less in terms of privacy, data protection standards. One might like this, or one can say this is just imperialistic. It's sort of global standards. So these are cases where I think I'm not so sure you are correct with your prediction. It could also go the other way around because we see lots of national policies evolving. But I think the European strategy will be to sort of set standards that particularly the US have to accept in the long run. This will also be the case with regard to content regulation. I think it would be good to first hear Jean-Marie on this point, and then we can go to your second question, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. I always struggle a little bit with the idea of polycentric governance. It's a bit redundant, in my opinion, because governance has to be polycentric, otherwise it's government. So there is this kind of fashionable term nowadays of polycentric governance, but maybe it just reinforces the idea of governance being polycentric, but it is by nature polycentric. And if we were talking about the human rights framework, there is a global framework, there is a global council, but there are also regional courts, the European one, the Inter-American one, and et cetera, et cetera. And we also have some provisions of human rights in national constitutions and court system and justice system at a national level. So in terms of digital governance, I think we can think about some kind of similar model. We need to have some baselines, some consensual ideas of what can be done and what cannot be done through digital technologies. And then it will differ, it will be applied in a different way in different cultural contexts, in different national contexts, but we need to have something that is global because the internet itself is global. And Jeanette mentioned the idea of these digital platforms trying to create worldwide kind of empires, so to say, with their own rules. And we have to address on the same level. You have global rules for Facebook users. We need global rules for Facebook users, but not dictated by Facebook, but designed by maybe multi-stakeholder processes. But apart from Facebook, different from Facebook, and more related to I guess, the United Nations, which is kind of the most global institution that we have.
Well, thank you both for your comments on the future vision of this digital world. So we have the second question was about how can we use technology to improve the global governance of the digital world or the governance of the digital world.
Your question reminded me of a discussion I've observed in Germany for the last 2 years. And that has been started from computer scientists who work in the field of artificial intelligence. And some of them think that when we look at national environmental policies and the little consensus we have worldwide on how to rescue our poor planet, that they think democracy is not up to scratch any longer, and we need different ways of solving the global problems we are facing. So many computer scientists say we are able by now, our sort of tools, analytical tools, particularly data analytics, they are so strong by now, we can come up with good models that show us exactly what needs to be done today to prevent global warming to go over certain levels. So why don't you let us do the job? And as you can imagine, most people are not super impressed with this idea to sort of replace democratic decision-making by technocratic decision-making. But one has to say these people have a point. We have all these data. We know exactly what we are running into, and our governments, with their short-term focus on the next election, are unable to sort of do the things that need to be done. So what does that mean? Can we actually rely on data analytics and AI-based decision-making to come to better results? Personally, I don't think so. But I started asking myself how our contemporary societies are going to integrate AI into everyday life, because I'm sure this will happen, and how we sort of will approach this technology, what kind of positive spin we will give to AI to sort of find it acceptable to automate decisions that used to be made by human beings. And I think one of the issues that we can expect will people convince is this what modern societies always try, and that is to extend their control onto the future, to sort of try to reduce uncertainty by controlling future events and make them less arbitrary. And I think AI will be a tool, or will be regarded as a tool to do so. I hope this idea is not too abstract. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeanette. I think that's interesting. Let's see what Jean-Marie has to say about that.
Yeah, I think my idea is even more abstract. But now, first of all, in terms of technological change, there, I think the idea of online election of ICANN board took place in 1999. So it was very early, maybe too early.
Well, 2000. I was a European candidate. It was 2000.
Okay, sorry, 2000. So it was maybe too early. But in terms of participation, we do see that many more people have access to technology, many more have access to the internet, and their voice can be heard through technology. So this is something that we have to explore. In terms of access to public services, I can see, for example, in Colombia, even in rural areas, and it's something that is implemented more and more. So there is a technological change that we can take advantage of. And the more abstract idea that I had is that technology is increasingly becoming a stakeholder in internet governance and in the digital governance. So maybe it's even more abstract than what Jeanette said, because I don't know how to deal with that, with this idea. But algorithm, artificial intelligence, and these kind of things machine learning and big data, they are stakeholders in digital governance. They are not something that we have control on. It's not only a tool for other stakeholder, private sector, governments, and civil society. They do have agency on their own. So this is something that we have to think when we think about multi-stakeholder governance. There is kind of a new sector that is not human, but it's part of governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. We have some questions here coming from the audience. So I will try to make them for you so you guys can answer these questions. The first one that I read here is it possible to comment a little further and with some examples the extent to what different political contexts and especially digital capitalism impacts internet governance? So she wants examples and maybe comment on that, the impact of this political context on internet governance. And I would say I would complement on digital governance, not only on the internet rules and things like that.
Yeah, just to provide a few examples from the chapter I wrote. For example, in Latin America, you have different types of different varieties of capitalism. You have different reaction to globalization, to the insertion in global markets. And it's very different if you're, let's say, Mexico and Colombia, and they're called like passive insertion. They're trying to participate in global markets without trying to make their own rules. While Brazil and Argentina, to give some other examples, try to make their own rules, and they have usually, historically, a stronger participation of civil society through protests, through trade unions, different kinds of participation. So these are different contexts within the same region. I don't want to go global because it would be too complicated, and on how to react to globalization, to the globalization of capitalism. And you can see some kind of similar trends when we talk about digital capitalism. In Argentina, this was the place where the first trade union of platform workers was created. So we can see there is kind of a tradition of unionism that is not as developed in other countries, even in the same region. So that was the idea of a little bit of this. How is capitalism regulated? How are the respective role of the state, of trade unions, of civil society organization, and the private sector historically, culturally addressed in different contexts, and how the digitalization kind of continue with some of these trends. It affects them, it changes them, it transforms them, but you can see that it's not the same thing to talk about the regulation of internet content in Colombia, in Brazil, in China, or in Germany. These are completely different contexts. So that was basically the idea, to bring a little bit of this institutionalist history of how to regulate capitalism in different parts of the world and to adapt it to the digital era, so that we don't have this idea of digitalization being one trend, one global trend, and what Jeanette said about this internet exceptionalism, like that the digitalization is something completely new that we don't know about, that is unprecedented. We can see that existing institutions adapt and regulate this digitalization in a different way in different countries. So I hope it kind of answered the question.
Thank you. Jeanette.
Can I add one point? Not to want to contradict you, but one could perhaps make the point that these trends of datafication that we see, this is probably a global thing, sort of integrating societies through reading data, analyzing data, ranking people, content, making them meet or not meet. I think that is something that goes beyond context. And since these data are usually milked with the aim of making a profit, as Shoshana Zuboff has described so vividly, I would say there are probably layers of global capitalism and regional capitalism.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. And this is the whole idea about varieties of capitalism. You have global capitalism, and it's addressed, it's regulated in a different way in different contexts. So it's very different if you talk about datification in the European Union with these strong rules to protect data, personal data, well, stronger than in many regions. And if you talk about datification in the US or in Colombia.
Yeah, but still, when we look at the companies who make the most profit with data analytics, it's a few global companies.
Yeah. These are global trends. I completely agree. Yeah.
Well, we have another question here. It's about how to improve global governance in an environment where the international organizations are now become weaker than in the past, because of different governments that are trying to limit the power of these international organizations. So, how can we think of global governance in this context, where some countries do not collaborate with international organizations? So you guys want to comment on that?
I wanted to leave it to Jeanette because it's a tricky question. I can start, and Jeanette might complement afterwards. The idea that international or intergovernmental organizations are in a crisis, I mean, it's been around for some time now. And maybe there was this kind of golden age of intergovernmental organization in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and with a strong leadership by the United States that we don't have anymore. But if we look at the longer history of international organization, they've been through, and if we go to the International Labour Organization that Jeanette mentioned, or even the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, they've been through a lot different world wars, and they still exist. So we're not maybe in the best moment of intergovernmental organization. There is strong crisis of the international liberal order in terms of international organization, but also democracy at the national level. So we can see that democracy is both quantitatively and qualitatively in crisis on a global level. But still, it doesn't mean that international organizations are going to disappear or become irrelevant because of the lack of leadership or because of the lack of confidence of citizens on a global basis. So that's what we have. I mean, they're not in a great shape right now, but that's what we have.
I knew I could rely on you for a positive note and to say, sorry, at the moment, the state of things is a bit low when it comes to the power of international organizations implies that things could change. And usually people say that crises turn out to be turning points. We made not good use of the financial crisis in 2008. Lots of people thought now things will change. It seems that the governments who wanted to sort of impose tighter regulations were still too weak. But now we are facing another big crisis, a vaccine crisis. You can already see here that at least in Europe, our the relevance we ascribe to health infrastructure has really changed. We now see we cannot just leave the production of all the medical stuff we need to China and India. We need to have an infrastructure here. Or perhaps it was a bad idea to sort of close so many hospitals. We need some, what one calls in regulation, redundancy. Even if they're not used to all the time, we need to be prepared for crises. So it could be that public infrastructure meant for the people will sort of improve a bit in some parts of the world. But then when we look at the distribution of vaccines, it's rather, I think, a depressing side we have here, because it will take years before all parts of the world will get sufficient vaccines. And you see rather a nationalization of the common goods than the global understanding of it. So I would think there is no simple answer to that. That signs for an improving situation, but also signs for that look more pessimistic.
Thank you, Jeanette. We also have another question here. I think that you both have answered about that, but if you want to extend your comments, it's about the role of civil society and what can be done to make this role more important and heard by authorities. So what you guys have to say about the role of civil society in governance of internet or governance of the digital world?
Perhaps one could say that at least in democracies, governments are only so strong as the support they have from their citizens. So citizens always can say no, and that also goes beyond elections. Of course, elections are an important point. We will see here in this country, Christian Democrats are just losing rapidly ground at the moment. So they will be punished for their policies over the last years. But of course, the influence of civil society also goes now way beyond elections. And that has a lot to do with the internet. We have such a strong public discourse in the meantime, because everybody can speak up on the internet, and it does impact governments. They are becoming frightened of criticism by the people. That, by the way, is not always a positive thing. The problem is that governments also become timid because they're afraid of how voters might respond. So civil society has become more powerful thanks to the internet, and that has a positive but also a potentially negative side. We can, for example, see that the growing right-wing scene in many countries really chases the government and changes discourse in a very negative sense. And depending on one's definition of civil society, one cannot deny that they're part of civil society, just an unwanted part.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about the idea of thinking critically about multi-stakeholderism, one critique to the very idea of multi-stakeholderism is to put on the same level the state, private sector, and civil society. Civil society is much more complex than one particular government or the private sector. Well, you have different interests within the private sector, but they are still a coherent force. Civil society is a space of struggle. It's not an actor. So we have different tendencies, we have different trends, we have different ideas. And I think what Janet just said about the unwanted parts of civil society that do exist is very important. So we have to acknowledge that we don't have one civil society position. We do have some civil society organization, but civil society is a moving object, and it has a constituent relationship with the state. And the state, when it works, has to include civil society by democratic means or by dictatorship, but still, civil society is part of a stable state. So if we look at the more complex, or if we look at civil society from a more complex perspective, then we can see that it's not the solution to the problem, it's also part of the problem, and we need to see how to deal with civil society, how to find consensus within civil society, and hopefully consensus that goes in the way of improving things and improving inclusiveness, representativeness, and democracy, that were the three themes of this particular debate.
Thank you. There is one point I'd like to continue this discussion about civil society. There is one point that we did not talk about, is the cybersecurity. It's now becoming even more important because most of the societies are now online, working, communicating, and entertainment. So the online world is not an option anymore. It's actually a critical infrastructure, and as a critical infrastructure, it could suffer problems such as cyber attacks. I have observed in different parts that when the topic is cybersecurity, multi-stakeholder groups do not include civil society. There is a difficulty of putting civil society and the military in the same table, in the same page, for instance. So I would like to listen from both of you in this critical issue that is cybersecurity. What is the role of civil society?
I think you're absolutely right. The closer a certain function is to the core of the power of the state, the less multi-stakeholder you find. And what you find instead is usually a very close cooperation between certain parts of government and the private sector, particularly military sort of industry, who produce solely or predominantly for the government. It's a very close alliance where there is, the only thing to get into this is to sort of uncover scandals. That still works in many countries. And I can see that both journalists and civil society organizations love to sort of dig up scandals in this respect. But it's very, very difficult to really get in there. I think it has worked in part with the financial sector, but this military-industrial complex is still very difficult to penetrate. I think you're right about that.
Jean-Marie?
Yeah, totally. It's even hard to analyze and to know what's going on because we don't have the information about what are the different armies and military sectors in different places doing. We know that there is a lot going on, but we don't really know what. So in terms, if we look at cybersecurity in military, in national infrastructure defense terms, then it's very difficult that we find a place for civil society. It would be kind of revolutionary on a historical level if we had civil society participating to decision making on national security. That hasn't happened before in any place, and I don't think it's going to happen with cybersecurity. But if we take a broader definition of cybersecurity, as, for example, the OECD is doing now by talking about digital risk, and this approach has been adopted by different countries, we can see an evolution towards a more comprehensive definition of cybersecurity. So maybe civil society is going to be excluded from national security issues, but they can participate into thinking, what does cybersecurity means beyond national security? Is, I don't know, gender violence part of cybersecurity? I would say it is, and civil society can participate in this kind of discussion. Is trust in digital e-commerce and digital markets part of cybersecurity? Probably it is too. And I've been working increasingly on peace building, cyber peace building as part of cybersecurity because of the particular Colombian context. And cybersecurity cannot be limited to national security. It has to include efforts to build a peaceful society. So if we have a broader definition, then of course civil society is going to participate. But yeah, it's going to be very difficult to approach the core issue of national security as it has been historically.
I can just comment on that. I think Jean-Marie is absolutely right. One way how civil society can get a step into that, sort of a foot into the door, is by reframing what it actually is. If civil society is successful in coming up with a definition that is broader than just what the government is responsible for and sort of to defend the nation, then there is a role for civil society. And that is often how civil society can be successful, by reframing issues.
Well, I agree with both of you. I would like to explore this a little bit further. When we talk about civil society, as you both have observed, it's not a homogeneous body. It has multiple interests and multiple groups. And academia is part of the civil society. So I think that academia has an important role to play in future questions. Let me give you an example. In particular in the US, I don't know in Europe, but in the US, there are several academic groups that are concerned about lethal autonomous weapons. So weapons that can, based on AI and others, take decisions to eliminate a person. So they are, and because academia has knowledge to discuss those things, they have been proposing the need of creating limits to this kind of AI-based weapons. And I think this is a role that civil society, in special a particular group of civil society, that is the academia, has to play. And just to complement this idea, I'd like to remember one thing that's called Amara's law, that was applied to proposed for technology, but I think that it also applies to internet, to digital governance. And the law says again, it's not a law, but that's something that people quote. We tend to overestimate the effect in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. I think that governance suffers from this problem too. So if you guys want to comment on that.
I think this is a very interesting idea that you are advancing here. And I would like to sort of extend it a bit beyond academia. I think that the whole field of technology development depends very much on people involved in this process to develop a critical stance. And what we can see right now beyond academia is that, for example, engineers working for Facebook and Google distancing themselves from the company targets and goals and saying, no, not beyond this red line. And they begin to problematize what seemed to be so self-evident for a long time what these companies were doing and that it would somehow contribute to the global good. The people working there, first of all, are faced with lots of criticisms, be it by their family, their friends, their neighbors. And they also sort of read the newspapers and begin to ask themselves whether they really want to be part of something that is so much to the detriment of their own life and that of others. So people critically involved in technology development, they are both their private sector, but they also wear a hat as civil society people because they are members of civil society. And I think a lot depends on how this plays out, how people who wear several hats, private sector, academia, technology development, and being members of families and local networks, how these different roles play together in people who we really depend on because of their specific expertise.
Thank you, Jeanette. Jean-Marie?
Yeah, I really like this idea, so I don't have much to add. I wouldn't rely on institutionalized academia as the solution to any issues. We depend on funding. We have relationship with the private sector, with governments. So we're not like the neutral force that is going to see and to assess everything critically. So it's not the way it works within academia. But it doesn't mean that academics cannot be part of civil society and have this critical stance and try to contribute to the improvement of a particular situation. But as Jeanette said, it's not only academics. You can also see this in private sector employees, government employees, and any kind of people can think as citizens, as users of digital technology, and not only as I'm from the private sector, I'm from the government, or I'm from academia.
Well, thank you. We are approaching the end of our panel. It was really a very constructive discussion of ideas, and I would like to ask you both to leave your messages and proposals for the future, so that the audience can take that message coming from two distinguished specialists and experts like you both. So it has been a pleasure participating of this panel with both of you.
I enjoyed it very much, and I thought it was a very nice, interplay between the three of us. I thought it was a really meaningful debate. I also learned a lot. I like listening to your replies, Jean-Marie. I think what we showed is perhaps one of the most important things I would like to stress is what Jean-Marie said, that civil society is a complex thing. It's a site of conflicts, and we must make sure not to romanticize its role. It's not just a progressive force. As you can see in Brazil, for example, there is also a lot of really right-wing hates-related movement in civil society. So we are not only looking at the government and the private sector, but we also need to turn our gaze to our local communities.
Thank you again for accepting the invitation to participate of this panel. It was great. Let's see what Jean-Marie has to conclude his participation and leaving his message about the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot to both of you and the organization. I also enjoyed a lot this discussion, and I'm learning a lot, and I took a lot of notes for future thoughts. But in terms of the take-home message, I've been very critical of multi-stakeholderism. I started my PhD like criticizing multi-stakeholderism as elitism, and this is really bad. But the context has changed, and I think now we have to preserve what we built in terms of multi-stakeholder deliberation, and we have to improve. We have to be critical, but still, the alternative is not very interesting in terms of authoritarian practices. And I'm not talking only about authoritarian governments as such, but also authoritarian practices by democratic government, which are also increasing. So I would like to maybe the idea to try and think on how to improve multi-stakeholderism was a discussion, and Virgilio showed this picture about Net Mundial. It was really like on the table. We have to think about how to improve multi-stakeholder model, and I think maybe it's just me, but I think it's been sidelined and it's not part of the discussion anymore. So multi-stakeholder governance is what we have, and it's not going to improve, and it's not good enough for regulating the internet. So I would like to go back to the spirit of maybe 2014 and try to go back to, we have to improve multi-stakeholderism. We have to take into account all the dilemmas, the dichotomies, the complexity of things that we've been discussing today, and try to see how we can adapt this to the present context and to avoid maybe this kind of trend towards authoritarianism in internet governance or any digital governance.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I would like to, on behalf of the organizers, to thank you, Jeanette and Jean-Marie, for accepting the invitation to participate of this panel. And for me, it was a big pleasure. I learned from both of you different views, and I think that's it. It was really a good discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Bye.